Hello, everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about the Marshall Trilogy. The Marshall Trilogy is really foundational and important to understand when you're looking at the broader context of Indigenous history in the United States. And the reason why is because these cases are still referred to in current Indigenous or federal Indian law, but they also do some really important things with establishing the doctrine of discovery and establishing the federal trust relationship, which is how we view the relationship between the federal government and tribal nations today. So the reason why it's called the Marshall Trilogy, there are three cases. The majority decision in all of them was written by Justice John Marshall, which is where it gets the name. So the first of these cases was Johnson v. McIntosh, took place in 1823. This case was actually between two white men who had disputed land claims over the same land owned by an Indigenous tribe. And this is one of the most cited cases in federal Indian law, cited over 40 times by current law cases. It's even been cited by cases that have taken place in Canada when it comes to the doctrine of discovery. And so what Marshall did in his written decision was he upheld the validity of the doctrine of discovery and used it as legal justification. What this case decision did was that it essentially created two different types of title. It created what's called absolute title and Indian title. And it gave absolute title of all of the land in the United States to the discovering sovereign, which was at the time Britain. And then that was then said to be transferred to the United States when the United States got its independence from Britain. So essentially it said that the United States owned the absolute or fee title to all of the land, and that the tribes only owned Indian title, or basically a title of occupancy, that they could live on the land, but they could not sell the land, that only the United States could sell the land. And so essentially one of the landowners that was disputing the land claim in this case had purchased the land from the tribe. And so the case held that title that he had purchased was invalid because it was not purchased from the United States. It anchored this Indian title in the doctrine of discovery, saying that upon discovery, all of the title to the land was immediately transferred to the discovering sovereign. So then the second case in the Marshall Trilogy was Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. This took place in 1831, and this case is really interesting because the court actually found it had no jurisdiction over this case. And so essentially, Georgia was trying to enforce its state laws on Cherokee Nation, and Cherokee Nation asked for an injunction against Georgia, essentially asking the Supreme Court to make Georgia stop trying to enforce its laws on Cherokee Nation. The court, like I said, cited that it had no jurisdiction. And this case actually did not even have a majority ruling because since it had no jurisdiction, it could not have an official decision. But the vote was split 2-2 and 2. And the opinions were essentially two believed that Indigenous tribes could be classified as what was coined domestic dependent nations, which means that they had diminished sovereignty and they were different than states. Two of the judges dissented, and they believed that these Indigenous nations were foreign nations, which means that they had full sovereignty, and that is actually the way that they were treated by the discovering sovereigns when they were first coming to the United States. And we know that the definition of treaties as a legally binding document between two sovereign nations, that these discovering sovereigns had to believe and had to have treated them as a foreign nation in order to engage in treaty making between them. And then two of the judges said that they are neither a state nor a nation, and so therefore they have no sovereignty. So the reason that this case is so significant is because Marshall kind of classified the Cherokee as what is now referred to as a domestic dependent nation, rather than a foreign nation with sovereign rights. So he created this, what's referred to as a guardian-ward relationship. And people still refer to that terminology today, that the relation of the tribes to the federal government is that of a guardian to its ward. And this is really where the trust relationship becomes established, and the federal government starts being seen as not necessarily in control of the tribes, but that they have inherent superiority, that it is their duty to take care of the tribes. And then the final case in the Marshall Trilogy is Worcester versus Georgia. This actually came a year after Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And the reason why is that in his decision, Marshall said, I wish that I could make a decision in this case, although we don't have jurisdiction. But if there was another case that was kind of asking the same question of, can Georgia enforce its laws on Cherokee Nation, then I would highly encourage it to be brought before the court. And so you have Worcester versus Georgia. And where this came in was this guy, Worcester was a white guy that was living on Cherokee land. And Georgia wanted to enforce, was still attempting to enforce its laws over Cherokee Nation and all of the citizens of Cherokee Nation. And so, sorry, I'm looking at my notes. So yeah, Worcester and Butler, they were federal employees working in Cherokee Nation. They complained that they were being unlawfully held by Georgia for not following state laws on the Cherokee land. And the decision was that Georgia cannot impose its laws over Cherokee Nation, which was the decision that the Cherokee Nation was looking for in the first case that it brought against Georgia, was that it could not enforce its laws over Cherokee Nation, over the tribe, over their land. And what the decision said was that only the federal government can engage in intercourse with tribes. States have no ability to enforce their laws on tribes. The reason that this is significant, because again, it seems like this is a win for tribal sovereignty, which in some cases it is. The fact that states cannot enforce their laws over these tribal nations is important. And again, you have this weird, hypocritical, and very complex relationship being created between the federal government and the tribal government, because if the tribes can only engage with the federal government, then there has to be some level of sovereignty there. They are being treated in some ways as a foreign nation by saying that only the federal government can engage in intercourse with the tribes, and yet they are not being given the full sovereignty of having control over their own lands by being able to sell the land or use it however they want to use it. And so in this case, Marshall was trying to reverse the Johnson opinion without referencing the Johnson opinion. He was trying to reinforce and acknowledge tribal sovereignty, like without really saying that he had made a mistake. And there is some really interesting language in that that decision. I encourage you to look up the written decisions for those cases, just because they're really interesting to read and to see the language that's being used to describe the tribes and the amount of independence and sovereignty that they have. But essentially, even though the decision by the Supreme Court was that Georgia could not enforce its laws over Cherokee Nation, this is where Jackson, President Andrew Jackson at the time, is purported to have said, Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And what this resulted in was the forced removal of the Cherokee Nation and what is famously known as the Trail of Tears. And so even though they had this Supreme Court victory, this is also where you see this imbalance between the judicial branch and the legislative branch. And that goes back and forth a lot throughout federal Indian law, where sometimes you will have the Supreme Court rule in a way that really hinders tribal sovereignty, and then you'll have the legislative branch come back with some laws that protect tribal sovereignty, and sometimes it's the other way around. So in this case, the Supreme Court did uphold a certain amount of sovereignty, and then the executive branch with Jackson and the legislative branch with the Indian Removal Act of 1830 came right back around and said, it's too bad, so sad. Georgia still continued to hold Worcester and Butler unlawfully for a while after this. And so even though the decision was handed down, it took a while for Georgia to comply with the decision. And of course, they did not fully ever comply with allowing the Cherokee to continue living on that land that they wanted. So that is a brief history, a brief dip into the Marshall Trilogy. Again, I would encourage you to go and find the written decisions for those three and just take a look at the language that's used. In a lot of cases in Johnson v. McIntosh, we see very racist language being referred to or being used to refer to the indigenous tribes as savages and as inferior. And then it's interesting to see the shift in Johnson's thinking or in Marshall's thinking in his later decisions.